Hey guys, Jeremy and Visser again with episode 4 of my YouTube channel. I don't really have a name for it other than my name, so we'll just call it my YouTube channel because it's more appropriate, I guess. Um, Once again, for those who are fairly new to the show or the channel, I am trying to teach myself as my Year's resolution to be better at conveying my concept of strategy and tactics and for Age of Sigmar to you folks. I am personally not a very good speaker, and I'm trying to work on this. So this is just all in a selfish vein to try to change that and address it. The Today's topic is design abstract, so there won't be as much like flashy visuals about like the concept as much because this is more of an abstract topic. But it's the decentralized versus centralized threat, and what does that mean for most folks who might not know this? A lot of like I would think most Age of Sigmar and even 40k folks already know what this is. They probably heard it in some other way. It's not a new concept or anything, but for this is in the vein of trying to educate and highlight some concepts to folks who might not know this, who are fairly new to the game or like just never put it down into this kind of formulaic way. So let's first define threats. What are threats? When you're playing your game against, when you're playing your Age of Sigmar game or Warhammer 40k game, your threat is things that can either kill you or basically generate points for your opponent. Anything that fits their overall strategy into winning the game. Uh, Most people think of threat as just the former, which is just killing things. But really, in reality, a threat is something that makes you have to make decisions on the board state to either make decisions which are necessarily not great for you. That's a threat. I guess if you want to summarize it down to it's essential. What does that mean? In some cases, when something is super killy, you're trying to either avoid it. In Age of Sigmar, it's about basically maneuvering away from it or around it or setting up screens, which are basically you're giving up resources to just basically slow down this threat. In 40k, for shooting, it could just be like by hiding from it, which means you have to maneuver in maybe suboptimal ways. That's a threat. It's a very linear threat. It's going to kill you, so you're doing things to prevent your opponent from succeeding into that. So in this case, you're making sometimes suboptimal decisions or some. And when so for description, an optimal decision in this case would be like, well, this thing is threatening, but not threatening it enough that like I don't have to throw sacrificial units to slow it down. I don't have to I don't have to care about hiding and take this suboptimal movement path to do what I want. Like things that basically where you're like, okay, you recognize it's a threat, but it doesn't really impact your ideal state of decision. It's is it really a threat at that point? Not really. And then there's the non-linear kind of like threat, which are like things about, okay, this unit, while it is killy, is expressing a board pressure that's not just about its core strength. So, for example, like think about giants for Age of Sigmar. Giants kind of like a lot of models and objectives. They are okay melee, but they're not necessarily the greatest thing. Like you don't necessarily have to work too much depending on what you're playing about their output. But just having that 30 like whatever plus model count on objective is a type of threat because it means that like if it's sitting on the objective and you're thinking like, well, I don't have the resources to necessarily kill the giant, and I don't necessarily have the resources to have more than 30 that many models on the objective, then it's like either you're putting yourself into a gambling situation where you're going to try to kill it maybe and you don't like because you think you have enough resources but not necessary, and then it fails and then you lose that point and then you're it kind of like unravels from that point, right? It's like this when you're throwing a gambling position, it costs you. So that's a type of threat. It's forcing decisions upon your opponent that are not optimal. That is the identity of a threat. I think we've kind of covered what a threat could be. Hopefully that defines and it's clear to the audience. Decentralized versus centralized threat. Okay, so this is about how to force your opponent into making these suboptimal decisions on the table, and it's a list design concept. We'll start with the more common one, which is centralized threat. Centralized threat, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's central to the board or central to the army. Centralized means it's an allocation of resources. So what it means is how much investment of your 2,000 point list are you making to make this unit a threat? Meaning, how many points are you investing into it to make it so that your opponent makes suboptimal decisions about it? And in some cases, while that threat is forcing your opponent to make a suboptimal decision, your job is to make it so they have to make that decision. Like if your entire what's the saying, like the best way to win is by making less mistakes than your opponent. This is the point of tabletop wargaming. It's about forcing your opponent to make mistakes, and you are playing this kind of like competing arms race into making that happen. It's either by forcing your opponent to take a battle tactic that's risky, and then punishing him with counterplay, or about forcing him to engage units which are very durable, and then he might not like have enough resources to kill it, and he can't take the point, or punishing your opponent's army by having so few units that you're just kind of everywhere spaced out, and devaluing his ability to maximize his killing power. Like those are all conceptually boiled down to how you force your opponent to make suboptimal plays in the game. So centralized threat, we're going back to that. It is about investing into basically like different war scrolls for Age of Sigmar or data sheets, or mechanics, command traits, artifacts to buff up certain threats or certain units in your army to make them these threat. And so I'll give an example for what that means. I'll use the Fireslider one because I'm a Fireslider player and it's my favorite faction. Hearthguard Berserkers are threatening on their own. If you just look at them in a vacuum, there are these 5 dudes for 150 points, which are 10 wounds, a 5-up save, 2-inch reach. You're probably taking the broad axis, so it's 3s and 3s, round 1-2 damage. On paper, it's okay. It's not great, but it's not also very expensive investments, for what they are. They are slow, so they're 4-inch movement and so forth. But then you're like, okay, but I have other things in the book that can make them more threatening. They have an internal clock, the internal rule that basically gives them a 4-up ward if they're holding even 9 inches of your Fireslider heroes. Okay, so there's an incentive to spend more points into heroes, so they have this mechanic, this additional threat value, which is stickiness. And then you can start looking into, they have prayers that gives them the ability to run and charge. Well, that gives them the fixes that address their reach issue, which now opens up a whole, adds that extra distance into the threat on the table. Their board presence pressure is now much longer because of that availability. And then you have a battlesmith who can give them, 4-up rally, which means like they're now even more sticky against certain matchups. And then on top of that, you can take an artifact, which they ignore spells on a 4-up, and now they're even more like sticky. Like they're just, but you can see cascades, right? Your opportunity cost of the list is that every time you invest in one of these other units to buff up that unit, and you're hoping that your synergy investment also buffs up other things, not just that unit. That's what you're looking for when list construction. You're looking for all these kind of force multiplying effects that like buff either multiple units or one unit, and then eventually it becomes this brick on the table that is like effectively, if you can jam it down the throat of your opponent and have it sit on a core objective, like as we've discussed in our previous video of the objective topography maps of missions, it is effectively forcing your opponent to engage it at some point, and it's probably going to be punishing for him to do that. It's the same concept of like, what is the equivalent of that? That is a decentralized threat. Gotrek. We'll use the fucking dwarf example. Gotrek is a 480 point investment, so he's more expensive, but he's still cheaper than all the other combination of investment to make that unit threatening. He is the same he's slower. He doesn't count as many models on objective, but you could argue he's killier, and he's definitely more durable because of his ward save mechanic, reduction of damage. And you can do the same thing. You can just jam it down the middle and be like, to deal with it. And effectively, he is forcing the same equational situation for your opponent. But there's more counterplays for your opponent to do that. All he's got to do is have more models on the objective than go check, which is 2 models. So it's not that hard. So like, but that he is in a sense decentralized. What if he had 2 go checks? Like, entertain me for a second. What if he had 2 go checks? Because the point investment you're making about 15 Hearthguard and all the support heroes is effectively the same points as 2 go checks. And all of a sudden, like, it's becomes almost equally the same value. Like, while it is easier for your opponent to bring 5 models, 2 go treks on an objective on the board, the space they take, if you keep them about 6 inches apart, make it impossible for your opponent to navigate 5 models easily onto an objective. And you've just achieved basically the same effective value for the same cost. But it is 2 decentralized threads. What's the value of that? Of a centralized thread? Well, you don't necessarily have to put both of them on the same objective. You can choose to go in different locations. You open up lanes. Like, it's why there's an inherent value and downside to decentralized versus centralized. And you're probably thinking, well, doesn't that just mean like it's about setting death balls versus not setting death balls? In a sense, yes, but you can design armies which have death balls and decentralized threat at the same time. Example, Knights of the Empty Throne. Knights of the Empty Throne are basically all about setting death ball army with decentralized threat in the form of Vanguard. Because Vanguard, you can, for effectively an opportunity cost of maybe 1 Sorcerer Lord, you're basically making 1 Vanguard unit like super killy, super durable, or more durable than they usually are. They're already pretty damn durable. And then the opportunity cost is you take more smaller units of Vanguard on the side, and then you get the same amount of value. So it really completely depends on how good the War Scroll is, what the sub-allegiance benefits from doing that, and all of a sudden, like, because that's the ultimate, like, zero cost, right? Because remember at the beginning, I explained that what makes or breaks decentralized versus centralized is the opportunity cost associated to it. If you have a sub-allegiance that rewards you for decentralizing your threats, and without sacrificing, by giving you all this synergistic measure, you're probably going to want to play decentralized threat. Ideally, you want to play both. Like, that's the list design you should really focus into. You want to have both. And it gets challenging. I will have a separate video posted with this one the same day. That is a list review of a Soulblight Veracruz Dynasty army concept. And it's literally about setting up both decentralized and centralized threats. Not necessarily as extreme as the Hearthguard example, but it's trying to find a nice balance between both, because armies which will go too much into one way will suffer because they're more linear in way they attack your opponent's table or address the board presence of your opponent's table. And it means that it's televised and it's telemetrized, or whatever you want to call it, in terms of what type of mistakes you want your opponent to make. I like having that diversification of investment into your list design, because you can approach the game as like, how can I punish my opponent's decisions in more ways than one? And so you want to find that one weird niche into that. So, like I said, this video was probably going to be shorter. I think I covered like the major important topics of decentralized versus centralized threats. And if you want to tune off now, because it's still been about 15 minutes me talking about this, feel free. Or you can go tune into the Soulblight review, where I kind of expand more and less abstract into a more real-term sequencing. But if you want to stay a little bit longer, I'll talk about the various reasons or the various examples into what centralized versus decentralized means. So and more of like list concept design. So we'll start with Gloomspite Gits. Gloomspite Gits are an incredible army about decentralized threats. Actually, I think they're one of my favorite armies for decentralized threats. You can get high wound density and squigs. Firstly, it's a squig list, of course. Why would you play anything else? You could play troll lists. They're also very good at decentralized threats. But I prefer squids. Squids, high wound density, slightly mobile, very low investment, and like basically buffing up their units. They have a lot of allegiance mechanics that just gives them value that are for free. For free, like they don't cost you an opportunity cost in list design. But what they really benefit from is the ability to just say, most people look at squig armies and like, cool, it's like the horror spam idea. It's like, yeah, it's a high wound density unit, but if I start the clock early enough to just basically chew through them, I'll eventually like win the fight. And it's about like setting your opponent in these positions to like want to have to engage the squids, and then having a bunch of counterattack units through manglers, through Boingrats or whatever like kind of unit or flavor you want in the backfield behind the squids, and just be like, okay, I'm gonna punish you by engaging. And since like squids have like this super high wound density, also model count, you can be very proactive in how you want to stretch out your line, and really basically like have almost zero risk of getting punished for being overextended. As you know, assuming you can keep yourself in range of your moon for the immunity to battle shock. You know, and I was gonna say there's the calm part. Your army depends on the moon being around. So I mean your loon shrine, not the moon. I mean the loon shrine. So you're gonna want to be very much protecting of that. So, but in this mission format, in which like most of the objectives are in the center quadrant, that moon can now cover a lot of ground very easily, and you're just basically going to hope, you know, if you're going to play the Gloomspite, you're effectively going in. You can't be conservative with Gloomspite. You just have to kind of like go for it, and then just hope your opponent makes enough charges into your line early so you can really punish them with manglers and so forth. I love Gloomspite kits. They're an ideal like decentralized threat army. Like in terms of that, you get a lot of cheap body count, and then pretty decent like you know value in terms of hitting power for your manglers and so forth. So in terms of I guess complexity army construction for decentralized, they're very low. I'll talk about another example of a centralized threat army, and that's kind of Seraphon. Seraphon is a very highly centralized threat concept. Now, you could argue they're also decentralized depending on what. So we'll talk about the centralized one, and that's the Skinks build usually. The Skinks builds are all about basically creating like these stacking buff mechanisms on top of like one unit or two units, and they're just buffing them up so they are, you know, getting much maximum value about each activation they're bringing. And even though they bring, and this is the power of Seraphon, is that instead of having like one centralized threat or two centralized threat builds and within the same list, they can have 3 to 4 centralized threat construction. So Thunder Lizard is one of that example where you can have 4, you know, you're investing command trade artifact on the engine of the god, and then all of a sudden it becomes like a centralized set by itself. Your Bastillodon and your Skink Priest becomes another centralized threat by itself in combination of each other. Your Slann and the Mana Boy, it becomes another set. Like they're creating paradigms of different centralized threats across multiple phases, shooting, movement, combat, that make him like, this is why Seraphon are good. Like this is why they're doing so well as an army, is because they feel efficient in every game. So you could argue, doesn't that just mean they're decentralized set because the investment cost is so little? Yeah, you could you probably, yeah. I mean, I can see that assumption, but are they this? And for me, I just conceptualize like every time you take a Bastillodon, you're kind of like, well, I got to invest in Skink Priest. Every time you take a block of 30 skinks, I got to invest in a Star Priest for the 3d6 charge and the poison. Like it's that equation. It's like if you're building a list and a unit needs to synergize another unit, it's a centralized threat concept. You're investing cost in the top of that unit to make it good. And I know that's not a revolutionary thought process here. I think most people realize that, but it's a concept that people tend to ignore. Like I've seen in construction, or I get asked a lot of questions about list design on a personal basis. And one of the things I notice is that like people like to look, oh, this, like we'll do Stormcast, for example. I love 10 protectors. 10 protectors are great. I'll put them in every Stormcast list. But what makes 10 protectors good in some of the builds is the combination of allegiance mechanic it either has in cities, or because there's a Lord Castellan or Lord Relictor teleporting them around. Like there's reasons why 10 protectors are making it into these armies because of the value they're bringing from the additional mechanic. Same for Fulminators. Fulminators are a fantastic war scroll. You don't necessarily invest much investment into making them, you know, hard hitting. They kind of do that on their own. But then you add the power paradigm of living cities and the move and shoot charge thing coming off the reserve, and all of a sudden like that takes them to the speed. And in this case, it's definitely a decentralized threat because there's zero opportunity cost for you to put them in living city. Like you get the allegiance mechanic outside of the command, the command ability needs to be given by, to move and shoot and fade. Sorry, needs to be given by a hero that's living city. So I guess there isn't a slight opportunity cost. Maybe I'm wrong, but the point of the story is, yeah, 10 protectors by itself does not make your basis of your army list. 10 protectors in something another reason makes the basis of your army list. Usually a Lord Castellan being around, or Relictor, or both in a Stormcast list. And then in Hallowheart, it's because of the spell combinations. Like, yeah, it's just, which means like to get those spells off, you need wizards and blah 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 blah. You can see the chain of process that goes on into that. So how do I guess, I was going to go over kind of like multiple factions and examples of those, but I think at this point people are kind of get it. So I'm going to go into like, for how do you approach list design now in reverse, with like how do you make those decisions versus decentralized and centralized threats. Um, Honestly, like the advice I give to everybody when they list design anything is, well, firstly, look at your pack, your GT pack, because most people design armies for GT packs, right? For events specifically. Look at the missions available to you. What are you going to be playing on those missions? Okay, what kind of package, let's call threat packages, do you need to bring to this pack to basically maximize your win opportunity? And by what I mean by threat packages, it's like, well, a threat package could be a set of decentralized threat. In that Verkos list I talked about earlier, not earlier, I'm talking the other video. It's a combination of Chadakar plus Kato and then two Varskir. That's a threat package. Like they do something very specific, and they apply a certain type of threat to your opponent's army. But what about a centralized centralized threat package? We'll do the Seraphon example. Bastillodon, Skink Priest. That's a package. So how many of those packages do you need to put together in the army list to basically create a combination that like wins your game? And the idea is that as you keep putting these bricks of threat packages you're building in your list, where can you see the synergy that exists between the threat packages? Like that's all about overlapping synergistic, like basically design. Going back to the Soul Blight example, my Blood Knight list, my Legion of Blood Knight list that I won a couple of GTs with, is basically about there's 3 sets of basically threat packages in the list, and they all kind of synergistically work together, and that basically enables this harmonious like list design, but also it has this winning multiplier in the table. I think is the way I would describe it, is because once one threat package gets dismantled or falls apart, the remaining pieces still work in the other synergistic of the other threat package, and that's the most important thing. So when you do list design, you don't need to choose decentralized versus centralized threat. You need to recognize what they are and mix and match both of them in the list. You want to have centralized threats which benefit your decentralized threat at the same time, and vice versa if you can. Right, it's all that matters. And hopefully, this concept it becomes clear enough for you for folks to, when they design the list, to be like, oh, I see a net list, or I see these war scrolls being used a lot, and I want to replicate that. Well, you have to think it more abstractly, like why are they in the list? What buffs them? What works together? And identify the threat package that unit brings to the list, and then identify the other threat packages and how do they interact with each other. So I know I'm not saying anything revolutionary here, hopefully, and if I am to some folks, kudos. I hope you learned something new. But yeah, I hope you watch the other video, which is way longer than this, and we're going to talk about specifically the Verkos Death Rattle list, because at heart, I'm a list design guy. I love writing cool lists and like bringing them to events. So take a look at that, and we'll expand on this concept in a more concrete way. All right, guys. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday, and I'll see you again for episode 6. where we will be talking about something that I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's probably something abstract again. Oh, I'm really bad at this. Okay, guys, have a lovely day.